Hello, everyone. Welcome to our working from home conversation with Jasmine O'Connor, the director of Anti-Slavery International. And Jasmine, it is a pleasure to have you on with us today. And also just to tell everyone that I'm obviously patron of Anti-Slavery International. I became patron last year, so it's massively exciting to have you on.
Hi, Jasmine.
Hey, hi there. Good to see you both.
So Jasmine, tell us a bit about Anti-Slavery International, who you are and what your mission is.
So we are 181 years old this year, and I think we're sort of pretty much the oldest human rights organisation with an international focus, and we were set up to be a solidarity movement really, and to support organisations wherever they are, whatever they're doing, to end modern slavery. And so today we've got work across Africa, across Asia, and at home in the UK, where we're supporting victims of modern slavery and are supporting organisations that want to end the scourge of slavery in their hometown or in their country or indeed the world.
And you work a lot of the time with advising businesses on how they can end modern slavery for people.
Yeah, we do. I mean, our ethos is that anybody can have a role in ending slavery, and actually we've all got a part to play, and in particular business has a significant part to play, because wherever business is sourcing in their supply chains around the world, there's the risk that individuals may be enslaved. And so business has to take responsibility, has to very proactively make sure that there isn't slavery in their supply chains, because I certainly don't want to be buying products, whether it's my PPE, which is a challenge at the moment, or my clothes. I don't want to be buying products that are made by slaves. And so we support a number of businesses to look at slavery in their supply chains, help them understand what it is, where it might be happening, and the sort of things that they need to be doing to remedy.
I had no idea that Anti-Slavery International was 181 years old. That's incredible. Who founded it, and can you tell us a little bit more about the original mission and how the organisation has changed over time?
Wow, that's a really, really good question. So I think our original founding was from a sort of group of individuals who came together to carry on really the work of the abolishment of the transatlantic slave trade. And they worked in a way which was seeking to understand what was going on globally and build the kind of alliances and relationships that you need to end slavery. So I think we've changed in many, many different ways over the years, but in our DNA, I would say that we've always been a campaigning organisation, an organisation that wants to look at the root causes and wants to go to the heart of the matter and won't leave any stone unturned in this fight to end modern slavery. So that's very much the heartbeat of us today, and I hope will be into the future. And I think for me, the most important bit in all of that is that we listen to the people who are most affected by slavery. So we listen to those organisations on the ground. We make sure that we're listening to people who have had direct experience of being enslaved themselves, because they know how best to tackle the issues and end slavery in their context. So yeah, a little nutshell of who we are and where we've come over the years. And yeah, it's just such a deep privilege to be leading this organisation, especially at this time where the challenge is enormous.
And can you talk a bit about the challenges at the moment during, we're obviously still in lockdown and COVID happening. So can you talk to a bit about sort of the PPE challenges as well, and what you're finding has changed in the last few months?
Well, absolutely. I mean, the challenges are enormous. I mean, I think the first thing I'd say that is, we all know that people who are in poverty are affected disproportionately by COVID. And that's very much the case for people who are either in a vulnerable situation or are already in a form of slavery. So, they can't isolate or self-distance. I mean, we've got stories from our programs, for example, in Mauritania, where the Haratine ethnic group is very much marginalized and are having to make a choice of, do I stay in my slum dwelling or my tent at the edge of town looking after my family, or do I try and go to work in a private house where I am indeed effectively treated in a very exploitative way to try and get money and food to feed my family. And, you know, we have had reports of people trying to sort of, you know, make that decision, go to work, but being told that they can't, having to go back home, being stopped by the police. And we've had situations where people have been, you know, in those households being given, you know, poverty wages or absolutely no money, and sometimes being told that they then can't leave that household because of the sort of need to isolate. And so they then end up in a very insecure place where they're exploited and abused in all sorts of ways, and perhaps their family is left to fend for themselves. So, I mean, that's just one example. But I think if we come to the PPE, one of the challenges that you see is that when there's a sudden change in supply and demand, you see the kind of conditions created, if you like, for slavery. Because some of the factories, yeah, exactly. So some of the factories that are, you know, being asked to make masks, for example, are having to ramp up production so quickly. And if the right controls aren't in place, you end up with a situation where the factory owner is really exploiting their staff, is treating them in a way that they cannot get away, perhaps to go and see their family. They don't have breaks. They're treated in a highly exploited way and are effectively enslaved, often owing debts to people, being put in a position where if you don't work, you can't pay that debt off, not having any money to actually feed themselves or feed them family. And ironically, in some situations, not being able to socially distance in their workplace or have any access to PPE themselves. Right. So an enormous injustice and enormous challenge that's happening around the world. And indeed, I think in parts of the UK as well, in some of the factories in the UK, there will be this kind of practices happening.
And Jules, you jump in because I've asked so many questions now.
I was going to say, you recently wrote a report that gives governments, businesses and the international community lots of brilliant advice, and we'll post a link to that report underneath this video. But perhaps you could just tell some of our listeners a little bit about the contents of that report and what they can do to help.
Fantastic. Well, look, I think I get, you know, it's a really complex situation that we're in, but you know, there are some really simple things that can be done. I mean, our report asked all of our partner organisations. We also followed it up with a survey to frontline organisations to find out how they're being affected. And I think the first thing I would say is that governments have got to listen. They've got to listen and understand the specific needs of groups that are oppressed in society and vulnerable to slavery, and groups that are enslaved. So, for example, you don't get a situation where people are effectively given the sorts of choices that I outlined in the earlier example, but the policies are designed to give the right levels of support. So that's number one, I guess. I think the number two is that they've got to listen to the organisations that are on the front line about the long-term challenges and the long-term needs, because there's no point if we're going to come out of lockdown and we're going to see the sort of global economy you know, drop, and again these sort of demands for slave labour, because it's cheap, because factories can cut corners, because masters can exploit people and make themselves more money. So what I'm saying is that our report really sort of also focused, and I think as we're coming through this journey, we need to continue to focus on the long-term efforts that we need to address slavery. And then I think the third part really is to, I guess, make sure that while we're in this difficult context, we've got to make sure that we are not letting the provision and the support of slavery organisations drop. So we found out that, I think, I'm just going to check my notes here, but we found out that you know, 100% of the organisations that we asked said they either were expecting to have more demand for their services, or had already got more demand for their services. However, most of them were saying that because of COVID and the impact of COVID, that 65% were saying that they'll either have already or will have to reduce their services. So it's this challenge that we're having to tackle COVID, and we're also having to tackle slavery that's ongoing anyway. And so, though, you know, that's what governments need to do. I think what your viewers need to do is, you know, get educated, you know, read our report, read the reports of other organisations, and actually, you know, step up and ally yourself with organisations like ours. You can become a member of our organisation. You can learn more from looking at our website, and we can help you effectively become an ally to the sort of global movement to end slavery. And then I think on our website as well, there's some sort of top tips for what to do in your own local context, because we've all got to be alert and understand that slavery happens all around us. It's not just in some far-flung country. So if you go to our website, I mean, I know it's a sort of easy thing to say, but there's so much there to help viewers understand.
We'll definitely make people aware of your website after this.
Fantastic.
And one of the main things that, you know, those are really great things that people can do and governments can do, and like, you know, thank you for making that so clear. You know, one of the things that we've learned from these working from home conversations is that people are working together so much more in the anti-slavery movement. So I wondered, from your experience, you know, with people now coming together more because of this situation, do you think there will be a systematic change with slavery? I mean, what do you think?
That's a really good question, and I think I'm sort of glass half glass, you know, empty, depending on what day you get me on that. Actually,
let's say you're full today.
I'm glass half full today. I think, from my perspective, what's been really good is it's sort of there's an ability at the moment to kind of equalise the conversation. So a lot of the time, you know, people who can get on planes, whiz around the world, have these meetings in sort of conference rooms, are the ones that are sometimes discussing it and setting the agenda. I think what's really lovely about the way that the world has moved to Zoom is the idea that it will stick on Zoom a little bit more, and we will be able to hear a lot more from those voices that are most affected. And I think, you know, my heartbeat is to make sure that we do that we really do listen. And I think the other glass half full piece as well is that, you know, there's more and more conversation that you know, we can't go back to this old way. We've got to look at actually building back better. So I do think that for those of us, you know, yourself included, at the Anti-Slavery Collective, for those of us that are calling for governments around the world and for individuals around the world to, you know, keep raising the bar and keep focusing on these issues and redouble efforts, I think now's the time to be making those calls. So yeah, glass half full.
Glass half full. And in that vein, Eugenie and I always like to ask for a story of hope at the end of these talks. So we'd love to hear from you a story of hope, either from during COVID or from before.
Okay, you're going to have to give me a second to think about this, because not because I haven't got examples, but because I've got a huge amount of examples. And I think for me, the stories of hope always bring me back to the partners that we work with around the world and the way that they have responded. So in really resource poor contexts, the commitment of anti-slavery campaigners to turn their hand to, you know, really making sure that they can reach out and support the people in their own home environment, I think is really critical. And I think one of the bits that I found quite inspiring was how a project that we worked with for a number of years in India had effectively set up this kind of reporting hotline, and in the COVID context, the way that was being used was just a quick fire solution that actually a lot of the sort of other bigger organizations sometimes are are sort of cranking up to try and set something up, but you've got all of these small organizations that can quickly turn something on and off. And so we've seen, you know, radio stations where we've got relationships with our partners on the ground in radio stations that have been creating awareness around slavery, suddenly turning their work to create awareness around COVID. So for me, what I've seen is the messages of hope, or the messages on the ground of committee campaigners just turning on a dime, as it were, and being able to be really nimble in their response. And I just hope that, you know, as we come through this and come out of this, the focus will be on their fantastic efforts, and we can, you know, redouble our engagement and support to those individuals that are the, you know, the real leaders in this movement.
That's wonderful. Well, Jasmine, thank you so much for speaking on behalf of Anti-Slavery International. If I could summarize some main takeaways for our listeners, I would say educate yourselves and educate others, and talk about this problem amongst your friends. Read the Anti-Slavery International report, which we're going to post with this video, and ally yourselves with other organizations, whether it's the Anti-Slavery Collective or Anti-Slavery International, but show your support through allying.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Bye.
Bye.